Ira Goldstein is the Senior Vice President of Field Operations and Corporate Development for Herjavec Group. Herjavec Group is a global leader in information security operating across the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. They specialize in managed security services, advisory services, and identity and incident response for enterprise-level organizations. So cybersecurity, very topical given our previous roundtable. Ira is an authority on cybersecurity solution development for enterprise clients and vendors, and he also advises on business growth and cybersecurity to public and private sector leaders. Ira is a published thought leader specializing in emerging business trends in cybersecurity, identity, artificial intelligence, and blockchain. Please join me in welcoming Ira Goldstein.
Thanks, Ira. Thank you. Thank you. So the concept that I want to introduce today is really a precursor for the next panel, where we're going to dive into, privacy and security implications of tech with a conscience. The previous panel was fascinating to me. The level of human-computer interaction is one of the trends that is driving what I'm going to talk about today. And the concept that I'm going to introduce is peak breach, and really ask the question, are we past peak breach? Are we past the point, can it get any worse from a privacy perspective? Can it get any worse from a security perspective? And what do those concepts mean? So I don't think there's any debate that there's an explosion of data that we have to deal with, both on an individual level, but also on an industry and public sector level. There's more data than we know what to do with, and this is a rendering of the satellite activity around our Earth. So it's not only the activity that is happening, in the physical world, but in space as well. And that's having fundamental changes to the way we interact with each other, the way we interact with our planet, and the way we interact with our galaxy. And so I think data has become a really important asset to individuals. For me, my data is an asset, but it's also a commodity for industry. And I was thinking about data as a commodity, and this concept of data is the new oil was popularized in 2017 by The Economist magazine. And if we start to follow through that analogy, that data is an important resource that we have as individuals, but it's also a commodity that's being traded, we have to think, how is the supply and demand being handled for that data, and how do we approach this new asset, which is, is it everlasting? It's obviously exploding in volume. And so the way I think about that is I compare it to the concept of peak oil. And so in the 1950s, geologists, when seeing the boom in the oil economy, there was a theory put forth that the world's oil reserves would peak and then inevitably decline, and there was a limit to the amount of oil that was able to be extracted from the earth. The red line in the graph shows what that theory was put forth in 1950. The green line in the graph is the actual extraction levels of oil over that same period of time, and you can see that the peak curve really came to be. But in the year 2000 or so, the curve started to trend upwards again. And the reason for that was hydraulic fracturing or fracking. And regardless of what your views of the impact on the environment of that are, and your views on fossil fuels in general, what you can likely agree on is that it changed the paradigm by which people looked at oil production. And I really think that the same thing is happening today with data and the way data is being handled. And so I want to introduce that concept to the group today and have the next panel opine on it, of course. So how do we measure the rise of the explosion of data? How do we measure it? One fundamental way that you'll see in any information security conference is the amount of money lost due to cybercrime. And so this is an FBI statistic, a paper that was recently put out by the Crimes Complaint Center, showing that we're at a very high level, 2.7 billion. This is the U.S. only for losses related to data breaches, security and privacy breaches. So, by the numbers, clearly we're at a high point. Will that continue to go up? Likely. I don't think we're at the peak for that. But what other impacts does the handling of data have on us as individuals, on society, and on commerce? So if we look at another way of measuring the explosion of data is how severe have these breaches been over time. And so looking at the past few years, there's a select number of breaches that I've highlighted here, and I think they're unique and important for different reasons. The Office of Personnel Management breach in 2012, this was the US public sector. And really this was significant, a lot of records, 22 million, but really significant because the profiles of public sector individuals in the US was compromised, likely by a foreign government for use in espionage. So this is something new, or at least it was out in the open for the first time. Target was significant because it affected the boardroom for the first time. Before Target, cybersecurity, information security as we called it then, was back page news. When a member of the board of directors and the CEO eventually of Target were impacted by the breach, the severity started to turn up. Sony, a company that didn't think they would ever be targeted, a media company. Why would we target a media company? We don't really have that much to lose. Clearly, we saw nation-state actors intervening in Sony, really due to their political stance, defined by the movies that they were backing, and so that was a watershed moment. Healthcare, Anthem, the most precious data that we have, health insurance, about us and our health was compromised. LinkedIn, in terms of the size and scope, our professional information, and it's marching up to hundreds of millions of records. Equifax, Marriott, what's next? Is it billions of records? Is it a new type of record? Does it even matter? And I think we need to consider whether we are at the peak in terms of measuring severity and whether we need to shift that paradigm to something different to measure these breaches in a different way. So what's another way that we can measure how significant these breaches were? It really comes down to the individual reaction to it. How much does society care? Are we outraged? Or did we stop being outraged a long time ago? If I'm shifting the paradigm to outrage, how much do people care? Or you could say people's confidence in companies and governments' ability to handle my data would be an inverse of this. I hope that that would go down and we would be at peak now. Or did we pass peak a long time ago? Have people really been sufficiently outraged at these breaches to make any sort of meaningful change? There's isolated groups that advocate on behalf of more privacy, better privacy. Really, I think what we'll come to at the end of this discussion is there is some privacy that we necessarily need to give up in order to ensure our continued security. We need to pick a horse in the ecosystem of digital identities and data so that we can ensure continued security. And so I'm really asking myself now, what is the future state? Are we at the peak? If things can't really get any worse, and from a security perspective, they could get worse. There could be loss of life. We hope this never happens, obviously, but there could be loss of life related to security breaches. But from a privacy perspective, if all my information is already out there, how do I approach the world? I'm obviously not going to hide and not use the services, but if data is my asset and I'm going to exchange that asset for goods and services, which is essentially what we do in the modern economy, how can I approach this world if we are past this peak? And so what I hope will happen is that even if the breach severity continues to increase by the volume of breaches, by the scale of them, and I think there's a certain inevitability to this. No one thinks that they can't get breached anymore. I really just hope that we can look at the paradigm differently and ask ourselves, what can we do differently as individuals, as academic institutions, as policymakers, to change the paradigm to say, let's put a basic assumption down that data is going to get lost. We should still continue to try to increase our resiliency, and I'm not taking away from that. Clearly, that's our business, at Herjavec Group as an information security services provider, and that's what I've been doing with companies and governments for the last 10 years. We should continue to do that. But if we shift that paradigm to how can I engage with that data economy differently, I think it will be a much more fruitful conversation than just waiting for the next large-scale breach. So what does that world look like, a post-peak breach world? I think people no longer have a reasonable expectation of privacy in a lot of their online interactions, unfortunately, because personal data is commercially available for buying and selling on black markets and on non-black markets. One of the most shocking news stories to many was the Cambridge Analytica scandal for Facebook. But despite maybe some misuse of the terms of services for third parties interacting with Facebook, were we really that shocked that as part of this ecosystem, third parties were getting a hold of our data? I think most people who are attuned to these issues weren't that surprised. So we know personal data is commercially available. Let's take that as a first principle. The responsibility for the protection of the data has shifted to the individual. Talk to your friends, relatives, parents, if you have elderly relatives, or we were talking about the impact of children getting engaged with technology. No one is looking out for them, and so they need to look out for themselves, or as parents and guardians, we need to look out for them. And that changes the paradigm. That means we need to choose certain ecosystems that we trust and focus on them as opposed to spreading our data everywhere and not having control over it. What is the relevance of regulation, if any? I don't know that regulation is really poised to catch up with this. Obviously, we've had dramatic privacy regulation coming out of the European Union. There's more privacy regulation to come, probably federally in the US and in Canada. There, I assume, eventually be some changes, maybe putting more fines around privacy breaches. But we can't wait for regulation to address this issue. It's something that is happening to us right now. And so if we follow through that data as an asset and data as my currency, let's follow that money. Who am I giving my data to? On the positive side, not to be all dreary about setting up this panel, there are some trusted ecosystems out there, globally and locally, that we should look to for an example of a post-peak breach ecosystem. If anyone has Face ID on their Apple, one of the most elegant authentication mechanisms that exists. If I want to pay for something and I do it through Apple Pay, they check that it's me every single time. That's pretty great from a security perspective. How do you feel about it from a privacy perspective? You need to trust that ecosystem, and you need to decide if you trust that ecosystem, give up a little bit of that privacy in exchange for more secure transactions. VerifiedMe is a project that was launched by Secure Key Technologies. It was actually just announced into production yesterday with the Canadian banks. This is a long-standing, several years in the making blockchain identity verification technology, and we'll see how it plays out in practice. But the promise of this ecosystem is to say, this isn't public, this is certainly private, it's a private company and it's the banks, but these are trusted institutions, in theory, that we give our money to and that we are comfortable with handling our identity data, and let's use them as a data store and as a clearinghouse to interact with other data services in the modern world. I think both of these ecosystems have a lot of promise. On the public side, you need to decide what do I think about this from a public policy perspective, because the EU has a common identity repository that they just announced, centralizing biometric data to ensure smooth access to different countries within the EU. Heathrow just announced that they are no longer going to be doing passport checks. It's all going to be done through facial recognition. Well, if I trust the European Union today, and if I trust Heathrow as an institution, that's great. It makes my trip move faster. I never need to show my passport before the plane. But if I travel to China, or if I travel to Ecuador, where they have a Chinese-made CCTV system, am I comfortable with a system like that tracking dissidents, for example, and establishing political will through surveillance? And something that I'm comfortable with today, will I be comfortable with that tomorrow? So I think we talk in terms of the rights and wrongs of governments. Many people see, well, the facial recognition in this country is bad, but maybe facial recognition in that country is good. We all know that over time governments change, and we need to struggle with these issues. I don't have a firm answer for today. I think the government should take advantage of these technologies, but we really need to decide what is a trusted ecosystem. With the private ecosystems, you're going to be able to opt in. With the public ecosystems, there's no opting in. You know, you live here and that means you're opting in. You can move somewhere else or not travel to those places if you don't want to opt in. There is no stopping the flow of data, and some of the concepts that I've put forward are really to start the conversation on how we're going to handle that as individuals, as industry, as government, and as academic institutions. As an information security practitioner, really my hope is that we handle it with a safer tomorrow in mind, but what I think that comes with is sometimes slight trade-off in terms of our expectation of privacy and the common beliefs that we may have around privacy today. Thank you.